Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. The information environment in which Americans form and discuss their political views has gotten weird. Walter Cronkite is gone. The editorial pages of the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal have lost influence to podcasters, social media influencers, and internet conspiracy theorists. Trump's rise and return to power was in large part fueled by figures on the far right who knew how to take advantage of this changed environment in ways liberals haven't yet figured out. This means that, if liberalism is to have a political future, liberals need to understand how media today looks nothing like media 20 years ago. And there's no one better at explaining how weird things have become, how they got that way, and how we can navigate through it than Renée DiResta. She's an associate research professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown. Prior to that, she was the technical research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory. And she's the author of the indispensable book, Invisible Rulers: The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported show. If you'd like to listen to episodes uninterrupted by ads from our sponsors, you can become a supporter. You'll get my newsletter ad-free as well. To learn more, head to www.aaronrosspowell.com. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Renée. I remember maybe a decade ago having a conversation with David Bose, the then executive vice president of the Cato Institute, about messaging. And he was saying the best way for us, being Cato at that time, to get our message out to people and to persuade people was the gold standard was an op-ed in the Washington Post, or maybe the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, but he was a Washington Post partisan. And I was talking about YouTube and this then relatively new podcasting thing, and that a lot of people were forming political views outside of cable news or nightly news or the major newspapers. And there was a skepticism about that. Like, no, that's just kind of fringe stuff. There's always been weird corners of the conversation, but that's not really where the action is. And I told David he was wrong then, but it's very wrong now. But I still get the sense people think that is the paradigm we're operating in. And so then there's just like, where did the far right come from? Where did Trumpism come from? We didn't see it in those places. So I wanted to bring you on to kind of tell us how weird things have gotten. And so maybe we could start with, what is wrong with that story now?
Can I ask what year that was?
I would say that's probably maybe 2012, 2013. I'm not quite sure, but a while back, a decade or so ago.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's actually sort of presciently early for you to be saying that too, because I think, there was this question about what matters more, media or social media. And these two things were presented as being very, very different and non-interlocking spheres for a long time. And I remember being in like clubhouse rooms during the pandemic when that fight would go on, in 2020. But for me, the feeling that the world had changed, I moved to Silicon Valley in 2011, right? I was in tech. I was in startup land. I had a couple companies. I was in VC for a while. But it wasn't until I wanted to help pass this pro-vaccine law, where I was like the person responsible for actually getting my own messaging out, that I really felt like the world had completely changed. Because per your point, there's always this sense that you just had to, like, the pinnacle was getting an op-ed into the New York Times. Like, that was how you reached people. And we were this group of moms, pro-vaccine moms, and we wanted to help pass this law in California to eliminate the personal belief exemption, right? This was right after the Disneyland measles outbreak. And we just wanted to make, public school kindergarten vaccine requirements a little stronger after that. Just say, like, get a medical exemption, these sorts of things. And we started, a bunch of us were like, okay, let's start writing op-eds to like the Sacramento Bee and the places that California legislators read and things like that. But I started looking at the comms of the anti-vaccine movement, right? Essentially the opposition, right? Just doing opposition comms research, and realized that it was 100% online, and that the online audiences were massive, and that they had invested for years. This was 2015 or so, and that they'd sort of made their first Facebook pages in 2009, and more importantly, that because of the kind of miracles of algorithmic curation at the time, if you searched even to run paid ad targeting on Facebook, it would pull up anti-vaccine keywords, but no pro-vaccine keywords. And just realizing how much investment in infrastructure had happened there. So there's again, these two spheres were treated as very separate. There were people who got their, who followed online influencers, who followed online media, who, believed in the power of memes to shape public opinion. And then there were people who believed that it was still broadcast media, which had a much larger reach. You didn't have the mass podcasters to quite the same extent at that point. But it was clear what direction the trend was going. And one of my frustrations with institutions, because at the time we were doing this, we would periodically talk to the CDC, right? Like, why aren't you guys in this conversation? Why aren't you in the general pro-vaccine conversation? And they would say like, oh, that's just some people online. People still trust their doctors in the end. People still trust, health authority and public health in the end. And it was so clear that the trend was going in the other direction, but you have to you're going up against an institutional communications culture that's so entrenched, that has always done it a certain way, and was reading articles that were still dismissive of online media. And I don't know if you remember the articles that came out when Trump won that were, saying things like, oh, like everybody's blaming social media, but it was really Fox News. And it was this weird idea that these two spheres were separate, that there was a Fox News sphere and a social media sphere, as opposed to things that were increasingly integrated. And I think it was the failure to recognize that integration on the left that has continued to be one of the reasons why it remained, remains so, I don't know if incapacitated is the word, but inefficient today.
A couple of questions about that then. Let maybe start with, is this story or this shift one of simply mediums? So you had a culture that was built up around particular newspapers, television, maybe radio, although that seems to be like the emergence. The talk radio rise in the 80s and 90s seems to be where this starts to fracture before we get to the internet. And so people were heavily invested in a certain medium, and then other mediums popped up that were easier to access, there were lower barriers to entry, and so on. But it was basically people doing the same thing, just in a new medium that the old medium folks weren't paying attention to? Or is this something fundamentally different? That the people in the new mediums weren't just doing what the broadcasters and op-ed writers were doing, but just on digital platforms, but they were like the fundamentally different nature of this kind of media information environment?
I think it's one key thing is how you think about your audience, right? So do you think about your audience as an active participant, or do you think about your audience as being receptive, or like a receiver of your message? So mass media, you're communicating to an audience. You're telling the people a story. You're reporting out the news. But what's happening in influencer culture or in content creator culture is much more of a back and forth. It's much more of a, hey guys, here I am talking to you informally today. This is what's going on in my life. Hey, I see in the chat that somebody's saying this. Let's talk about that, right? So it's a much more integrated, much more participatory culture, and that participation really builds the relationship between the influencer and the crowd, if you will. And the crowd becomes an amplifier, right? The crowd moves content. The audience, the followers move content that the influencer or content creator is making across all of the other platforms. So maybe they're making content on YouTube, but people who really love that content on YouTube are sharing it out everywhere else on the internet. So each different app has a different feature set perhaps and different people who spend most of their time on it, but the connectors in that social ecosystem are people. And content creators are thinking about their audience at all times as people who are going to share their message and people who are going to participate in the creation of the message. There's another thing that's interesting, which is that in order to be a content creator, you really start by appealing to a particular niche, right? Mass media was attempting to appeal to a very, very broad audience. It's speaking to the entirety of America, right? The nightly news is broadcasting to all of the homes, whereas the person who is making a Substack or making an Instagram knows that they're not going to be able to reach all of the people at all, all of the people all of the time. Um, and in order to grow their audience effectively, in order to appeal to the algorithm that's going to push their content out, they have to be making content for a particular community of people who then are going to want to engage and share and participate. And so it's just a very different relationship development process and a very different process of relating to the audience and thinking about how the message moves. It's not top down, it's bottom up and participatory. And I think there's, there's room for both. Sometimes I don't want to hear news that is catering to a particular niche. I want to hear as neutral and broad a take as possible. I like listening to the AP. I like listening to Reuters. But people really do like sharing and engaging with media that they feel is created for them, that they feel represents them, and is speaking in the kind of voice that they themselves would be speaking in.
Is this where we get the audience capture that you talk about in your book?
In the worst cases, yeah. I mean, so I study adversarial abuse, right? I'm studying the worst things. The bad stuff. There are plenty of influencers out there who are just making good content and kind of chugging along true to their values and and are resistant to being pulled in particular weird directions or into weird rabbit holes. There's a real pressure there. I don't know if you remember. After October 7th, people, you would see in the comments on creator posts, why aren't you talking about? And then there would Palestine or Israel, depending on where they thought that they could pull the person to weigh in. And this was a really big deal. And you saw this sometimes during various officer-involved shootings and violence against Black people. You would see that same, why aren't you using your platform to talk about this? And so there are these demands that the influencer will feel at times from the audience to speak in a certain way or say a certain thing or to disavow someone or something or to avow someone or something, right? And so there's that pressure. And one of the things, because you are best able to monetize when you're appealing to a niche, there are other people who are competing with you for that same niche. And so you do see creators who are willing to say the thing, willing to meet the worst impulses of where their audience might want them to go, who go and do that. And that's when we talk about, how did so-and-so get to be, I remember when a person who will not be named was a reputable reporter, and now look at them over here, they're like a UFO crank, right? And you see this, you see these trajectories, and everybody has seen somebody like that, and it's a function of fear of losing the audience if they don't deliver what the audience wants.
Well, you were saying that, it made me wonder then, there's this ongoing question, and this goes back to Trump's first victory, or even when he was on his rise before his first victory, of, did Trump discover his audience or create it? Was there always that group of people or not? And I think about that in the context of what you just said, that when we see, say, the story come out of this last election, or one of the big stories is the shift of young men to the right compared to where they were, and the divergence between young men and young women and their political views. And we point to these right-wing Joe Rogan and video game streamers and so on, where young men are getting all this, watching kind of right-wing content. These are the spaces that young men hang out online are just kind of a soup of right-wing stuff a lot of the time. Is that audience capture in the sense that young men have always felt this way, and now there just happens to be these niche creators who are giving them video game content that also tells them that it's bad that girls play video games or something, or is there an influence thing at play here?
I think it's both. I mean, the idea that persuasion happens because you hear something once from a person and then magically your mind changes. Like social science and communication research since the 1940s has disproven that. I think, the hypodermic needle theory of communication, which argued that, you would see something on the media and then your mind would be changed. What was interesting about that study, this is Katz and Lazarsfeld, I think back in 1947. What was interesting about that, the dispelling of that idea, was that it happened because they began to study how people's political opinions were formed and realized that it was actually they studied this group of women that were paying close attention to the media, and then they in turn would talk to their friends, to their communities. And as they began to study the dynamics of communication, they started calling it two-step flow, where this particular group of women, I think they called them opinion leaders, would pay attention to the media and then would communicate to their friends, and the friends would report that they actually formed their opinions based on how it was mediated by the women, right? By their friends. And so there was this process of like, we all kind of discuss the news and the things that we hear. And this is what's happening on social media. And so you are having this process of sustained interaction. I almost think, the influencers sit in this really weird place where they're sort of both media, but also opinion leader, because they play that role of friend. You're in there and you're having these conversations and you think of them as like somebody who's just like you. One of the things that I think is interesting about the podcast and the communities that you're talking about, though, is that these are people who are incredibly influential in normalizing certain types of language and behaviors, right? So I don't know that it's necessarily persuasion around ideas. I haven't studied that. I don't want to kind of weigh in because I haven't seen how many people actually change their beliefs after following a particular podcaster for any length of time. But it's this, there's like the language that kind of comes out, but, gets worked into conversation and becomes normal. And it is sort of like, I think, shifts in the Overton window around what you can say, because these idols, these people that you think are extremely cool, are saying it. And so it's no longer taboo. I feel like there is, we're incredibly like shameless now. Things that um, it almost reminds me of like the sort of shock jock phenomenon, but there were still lines that couldn't be crossed. And now I can't think of any lines that can't be crossed. We're watching this remarkable situation play out right now where a young man with an anonymous Twitter account was part of the Doge team, and he was revealed to have had this anonymous Twitter account by a Wall Street Journal reporter, and I believe he was fired, or resigned. And he was saying some pretty racist stuff, right? Some very racist stuff about normalize hating Indians. I could never marry outside my race. Proud to be a racist. This sort of content. And the vice president of the United States made a post saying like, well, we don't want to penalize young people for silly opinions, and I think it's perfectly reasonable to hire him back, right? So there's just some questions around like, what is beyond the pale at this point? There's a lot of, because that kind of content, that kind of speech, like you do see and you do hear in a lot of online environments. And I'm sure that he felt perfectly comfortable saying those things anonymously because it's just how certain groups of young men communicate today.
I think one of those deleted tweets, he said, "I was racist before it was cool," which is like signaling, I think, builds upon that of it's not just that he felt, but he was like a trailblazer, whether he was or not. I mean, but he like claiming to be, all the rest of you are posers about racist, but I'm the real deal, which is like an extra level of I feel comfortable. I felt comfortable even when the rest of you didn't.
Or
is the claim.
this is the brand I'm building for my anonymous online persona.
Yes. Why is the right better at this stuff? So we don't tell a story of the last 10, 12, 15 years where old media never really caught up to this. Influencers popped up, and suddenly all of the young men have turned Maoist, right? They're going right and not left. But it doesn't seem like there's anything inherently about the nature of right-wing ideologies that would work better in these mediums and these kind of influence things than left-wing stuff.
I don't know. I mean, I have theories. One of my theories is that the right makes it feel more fun. And I don't know if there's, again, I don't study the right professionally. That's not a thing that I've ever done. I don't, I've never been a scholar of right wing influencers or whatever. But where it intersects with the things I do pay attention to, which is mostly like how do political narratives spread and how do political rumors in particular spread. One of the reasons why the right is more effective at spreading political rumors than the left is that the right is absolutely willing to just say the thing, right? Because there's not going to be any kind of like social ostracization or loss of reputation if they do. And there's this phenomenon that I think about a lot that there's this professor named Damon Santola. He described it, the complex contagion. And it's this idea that, again, it kind of relates sort of in a way to the two-step flow thing, where in a simple contagion model, like information spreads from person to person, and you would expect that an idea that is already normalized, there's no cost to an influencer to repeating that idea because we all already believe it, right? Everybody in the community thinks it. There's no cost to saying it. But in a complex contagion, you have the situation where somebody has to decide to take the reputational risk. So the influencer, in a sense, becomes the gatekeeper, right? They see all of this stuff in the ether around them, and they can choose what, they see this like kind of bubbling up, and they can choose to amplify it or not. And one of the things that we started seeing on the right in 2020, in the realm of like election rumors, was an absolute willingness to amplify. And it would be like, big if true, someone should look into this. Like these crazy outlandish rumors, there was no cost to boosting them, but they would do this little verbal hedge, big if true, someone should look into this. And then by 2022, the verbal hedges were like disappearing. It was like, they're doing it again. They're stealing the election. Look at them. Here they are doing it again, right? Because it was so normalized that you would almost, there's no ostracization, there's no penalty at all because like, why wouldn't you amplify that? Because, your entire base already believes it. There's no cost to you. And so there's a combination of willing to seem edgy, risk-taking, funnier memes. You don't worry about whether or not you're offending somebody. You don't have to be constantly concerned about if your language is going to piss off some random niche, sub-faction of your ideological tent. And it's much more freewheeling. And what this means is that it's very effective for having a whole lot of things that are constantly thrown out there. And you can just see what works, right? You can see what sticks because people are constantly tossing out these ideas and retweeting them and boosting them, and some of them take off, and then everybody starts to talk about the same thing. There's just this, it's not message testing from the top down where we're all sitting in a room deciding what the thing to tweet about this week is. No, it's much more this like freewheeling process of pulling stuff up from the bottom, saying the thing and letting it, and seeing if it flies. And it's just an extremely different way of engaging versus like, gosh, let me message test this. Did it piss off some constituency or another?
But that would it seems like there's a tension between that and those mechanisms and the success that the right has found with those mechanisms and the way they talk about the platforms on which they're having this success. So what you're describing couldn't really work in the old media paradigm because it is to test out an idea on cable news or in a major newspaper is costly versus just retweeting something is zero cost. And the mechanisms of spread are also close to zero cost. So it can go viral and it doesn't cost you. And so you can try out everything as you've just described. So that is dependent upon social media platforms. And the right has essentially social media memed itself into the White House now twice. They've had tremendous success in the right-wing podcaster, the online manosphere. All of this seems to be working very well for them. And yet, the other thing that was happening in 2020, 2022, when you're describing this success and this shift, was we were being told all of the technology that they're using to do this stuff and having great success with is incredibly hostile to them, that their views are being suppressed, that they're being censored, that the whole world, the whole tech world is out to get them. But that seems contradicted by the fact that they were the ones who were like all over the place. And, there were all these, like, every month Facebook would say, here were the top posts of the month on Facebook. And they were inevitably like all right-wing podcasters and cable news hosts and influencers and so on.
So there's that was a propaganda campaign. You pick your message and you see what works. And in 2017, you started to see these, when Trump was in the White House, you started to see these arguments that, that they were being censored and that the platforms were biased against them and so on and so forth. And so it became very effective, though, because, again, it was a way for everybody has had a bad moderation experience on social media. I'm sure you've gotten some bullshit automated moderator call that was wrong, or like you used a word and you got slapped down for it. Everybody's had some bad call. I used to actually ask people about this. I was really curious about people's perceptions about it on Twitter. Because you would see people saying, I've been shadow banned. And I was sort of intrigued by this because it would be completely like normal people with like maybe 100 followers, not prominent at all. And I would periodically ask, like, why do you think that? And they would say, because my friends don't see all my posts, right? So there was some of it came from like a lack of understanding of how curation worked, and that, while your post didn't get surfaced because the algorithm didn't think it was good enough. And, we've all been there. But the ability to create aggrievement is incredibly effective at making people feel called to participate in a messaging movement or an activism, right? So by saying you are being censored, we are being censored, here are all of the examples in which I am alleging that we are being censored. And then you'll recall some of Trump's posts did start to get labeled, right? And then they reframed labeling as censorship. And then they reframed, everything became censorship. And they sort of took this word, this term, free speech also. I kind of joke around about this, like free speech as meme, right? Where instead of it being a thing that references a set of laws or values, we just have free speech, the meme, where as soon as you say it, you've invoked that sense of grievance and shared identity, and people know what they're supposed to say and do with that. Same thing with the word censorship. Oh, whenever you hear that, the person who is doing the supposed censorship is bad, and the aggrievement machine kicks off again, and the narrative begins, and you can make another viral moment. So it's a frame that is useful and that you can keep referring to it, and that is one of the ways that that message setting has been very effective. So it's not a thing that's borne out by any evidence, but it was an effective term and an effective campaign, and they continued to run with it.
But we've heard stories of administration jawboning.
Oh yeah.
And then when Elon Musk took over Twitter, he released a bunch of internal documents, the Twitter files, which lots of people believe shows that there is in fact what's the phrase, that censorship industrial complex at work. Is that just all wrong?
Well, I'm told I run it, and I don't know what it is. So This I ran it 2 years ago. It's unclear to me. Maybe I got fired. They talk about other people now. No, look, the Twitter files could have been really interesting because platform moderation is completely opaque. Again, as I mentioned, we have all had weird experiences with the auto mods where you're like, why did I get tagged for that? I don't really understand it. There are clearly people who do get shadow banned or throttled for whatever reason. It's not always clear why. And it's also incredibly hard to appeal. And Furthermore, the entire process of curation is entirely opaque. You have absolutely no idea why a post is, curated or not curated. And so you have this very opaque system, and it's completely unaccountable private power, right? You have no control over it. Um, and so that does create a lot of suspicion and resentment. This idea that the government was like colluding with the platforms to steal the election from Donald Trump. I think that's what I was accused of doing. That's the part of the censorship complex I ran, allegedly. And they again, it was just this like it was a meme. It was a meme they created. It's a thing that doesn't exist, but they gave it a catchy name. And through that process of creating a catchy name, they managed to allege that in my case, a private entity doing research and occasionally communicating with another private entity was a secret cabal. And even when we put out the information, about what we were doing or what we had done, it doesn't magically make the meme go away. The meme continues to stick. With regard to the government job owning, this is a really interesting thing. We should want transparency around government communication with platforms. That is a perfectly reasonable thing for us to be lobbying for, if you will, small L lobbying, in the sense that it platforms or governments, I should say, have their own First Amendment rights. They should be at times communicating with platforms. One of the things we saw from the so-called Facebook files that Reason put out was Meta repeatedly reaching out to the government, right? The platform reaching out to the government to ask for guidance on what to curate and surface during COVID. So you see this recognition that the platform has where it's saying, okay, there's a pandemic going on. I should probably surface as good information as possible. Like, who is best equipped to know what that is? Well, it's the CDC, so let me go and ask them. These are communications that are, in my opinion, perfectly reasonable. The idea that the government and the platform shouldn't be communicating at all, I think, is crazy. But saying that there should be some transparency component to it, I think, is also reasonable. And one of the things we've seen consistently over and over again is a complete reluctance from Congress to actually pass any kind of legislation for platform accountability or transparency. So one of my conspiracy theory is that it's because this allegation, the allegation of censorship and the continued ability to beat up on platforms for not doing anything remains a effective way for congressmen to raise money. They're not actually incentivized to do very much about it.
We are recording this less than a month into the second Trump administration, and it has been a whirlwind of awful things that has come faster than I think even those of us who were pessimistic anticipated. And are seeing this is all happening in a world where Twitter is owned and increasingly being, bent to the will of Elon Musk. It is not the free speech platform that it is billed as. We see a fragmenting of the social media landscape. We see the attempt to force a sale of TikTok, and depending on whether that happens and among the people trying to buy it, TikTok could end up looking like Twitter does. All of this is, if you were upset about communications between the government and leadership of platforms, you ought to be rather mad about Musk right now, who seems to be running both the federal government and Twitter. For people who are concerned about the direction of the country and want us to survive the next 4 years and right the ship, I guess, what should we know about this environment and how to get the message out, how to persuade, how to have an impact that's not, it feels like kind of the old style of publishing at the Washington Post or New York Times, which themselves seem less interested in being adversarial and than they used to be, is becoming even less and less of valuable contribution. What do we do? What should we know about this environment?
Well, first, obviously, Jim Jordan should hold hearings to, investigate the communications between the government and Twitter. This is a thing that we need to investigate. It's very serious. In all seriousness, though, I mean, if there was anything that exposes the extent to which that was just a propaganda campaign by a machine, like this should dispel any notion that there was any serious legislative concern in any of those hearings that Congress held. As far as what to do, this is a really interesting question. So I've seen a whole lot of uh, congressmen and senators wind up on Threads recently. They're showing up quite a bit in my feed. Threads, of course, is the sort of meta competitor to Twitter. Blue Sky, also, you're seeing a lot of the more lefty activist class and media kind of taking off there. So the problem is that then you have people are not talking to each other. They're not fighting the narrative battle on the same battleground. And this is something where I think it's if you are in both of those spaces, it is jarring to go from one to the other, right? To go from where the dominant conversation and trends are on Blue Sky back over to Twitter. You also can see quite clearly, though, Twitter's curation really clearly rewards particular, at this point, the sort of the people who pay, right? The blue checks. It is not a, no social media platform has ever been neutral, but there is a very clear political alignment, and it is effectively a tool for that political alignment at this point. And so people who are not of that political alignment need to make sure that they're building their counter infrastructure in other places. Substack is another option, or newslettering. This question of how do you engage in the same space, I do think that the, you know, the institutional speakers and leadership, and you're seeing like Judiciary Dems and some of the others who are in there on Twitter. If you're participating in that space, you have to participate using the language and things that resonate in that space, just so that the content goes viral. It's just not the same as the sort of content and narratives that work in established media. I think about it sometimes almost as like you're like fighting a propaganda war, but you're responding to the propaganda with explainers as opposed to with counter propaganda. And if you're choosing to participate in that battle, that sort of battle for public opinion, that opinion shaping that's happening in the partisan battleground right now, it's it's not clear that mainstream media is like the tool for that. You don't want it to be, I don't think, but it's not clear that they've built any kind of infrastructure to do that alternative equivalent on social media. And so that's why it feels very much unbalanced. I was really surprised at, as the USAID fight happened over the last couple of days, the vacuum of the vacuum in which the social media narratives on Twitter were almost entirely unchallenged. There were sort of, kind of small pockets here and there of people beating the drum on like this, like fact checking almost. This story is not true. That story is not true. This story is not true. But there were so many of them, and responding to the individual points, I think just it felt very diluted and very fragmented. There was like one clear message, like USAID is terrible. It's like woke totalitarian spending, and there was really sort of no message that had appeared to counter that on the other side. And then on Blue Sky and Threads and mainstream media, you had more like fact check content coming out. So it feels like almost entirely different types of media at this point, and I don't know. I don't have an answer for how we come back from that.
Is this an argument for, call it a generational shift? So the Democratic leadership is quite old, and they keep putting back into power people who are quite old. And I know that, I'm active on Blue Sky and have this podcast, but I don't talk in the language that sells on social media. And I think if I tried, it would sound very inauthentic. Like, it's just, I'm not raised in this culture. And so I'm wondering if the answer is, there's that old show 21 Jump Street, of like catching the criminals by having these like young police. Like, is that kind of what we need? Is like a liberal 21 Jump Street of, it's the next generation have to be the ones to talk the talk, because
It's
Those
happening. It's happening, like, they're there, right? Like, I watch a lot of streamers, and there are, and they make it really funny. It's funny and it's fun, right? And that's what I was getting at. I don't know if I, like, articulated it as well as I could have, but, that same irreverence, that same, like, sense of we're participating and we're joking around and we're not gonna worry about if we use the wrong word and stuff like that. Like, you see that culture in certain places. Like, streamer culture is very much there. Like, I like watching it. It's entertainment. And it pulls people in and, you can have a political conversation, but you feel like you're, kind of doing it with your friends and, um, it's just very different. There's also, there's like TikTok. I am not personally a big like TikTok person. Like I don't love it, but people really do, right? And the content is right there. And again, it's this question of like, what do the networks look like? Where are the networks of transmission where these pieces of content make their way from one spot to the other? Where are the people who are being that glue in the system from one place to another? I don't see it as much, and it's harder and harder um, to look at these things academically. I think there's a handful of universities that are still, studying Twitter data in the way that we used to a couple of years back in 2022 before everybody lost their API access, and can, give you quantitative answers as opposed to vibes. Like Kate Starboard's team at UW is still doing some of this. There's a handful of them that are still in there. But this question of um, where the you know where the where the narrative hops happening and who is the glue in these systems, like who are the influencers that are both there's two different phases, right? You've got people who are coming up with the messages and the memes that work, like, engaging with their audiences and doing that process of like developing, like, just very organically, like this is how we talk about this. And then there's that process of like spreading it and sharing it and making sure people see it. And these are not necessarily the same thing or the same people. So it's thinking about that entire ecosystem just hasn't really been a focus of the left.
Is there a tension between, you describe kind of irreverence and fun and jokiness, and then impressing upon people the seriousness of, because I think one way we can interpret, say, the Democrats were very, very quiet in the initial blitzkrieg of the Trump after Trump came into office, is a lot of their strategy to beat him in this last election was to portray the serious threat that he represented to the country. And they lost. And so it feels like a lot of them interpreted that as people didn't take us seriously when we said that. They tuned out. They didn't want to hear it. They didn't believe it. And if we go back to that well and say, no, this is actually like really serious, they're not going to believe us. And so we should try to position ourselves as, we'll call out the bad stuff, but we'll try to find ways, we'll moderate. Um, but it seems like if we are talking about, legitimate constitutional crisis, that's a harder thing to do jokey video game streaming commentary about than if you are the guys who now think it's fun to be perpetuating the constitutional crisis.
The I mean, it's an interesting question. I'm also realizing I keep saying left, and I don't even necessarily mean left, right? Because center right is the people who are troubled by what is happening coalition. I don't even know what we call that. I mean, sort of left has become shorthand, but it isn't even really correct, right? Because there's many, many different, micro communities within that. Um, Getting across the severity of it, I think you can still do that in ways that sound like internet speak, right? It's not it's you can do it. I mean, there was a story that came out this morning about the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children being told that I think if I recall correctly, it's that their funding was at risk of being cut if they didn't take down certain LGBTQ content, right? And keep in mind, like when you think about the work that NCMEC does, some of this is, runaways who maybe are leaving home because they are LGBTQ and their families are not supportive. Some of it is kidnapped children. Some of it is trafficked children. And then some of it is child exploitation content, right? These are the people who do some of the hardest work that there is. And there's opportunities for all different voices to be speaking about this in whatever way is most appropriate. You can have the politicians, and in my opinion, the center right should absolutely be speaking about this as well, out there saying like, okay, this is egregious, right? This is not the kind of we shouldn't be threatening the funding of a critically important agency over this. Yeah, over this. Like, this is not appropriate. While also you can envision ways in which people who speak more about those topics in the language of the internet can do it a little bit more irreverently. So there's different ways, and I'm not saying that everybody has to do the same thing. I don't think that they can or should. I think it's a matter of understanding, like, what role do you play in this, in messaging and in speaking to your particular audience, speaking to the people who listen to you. And if you're in academia, maybe that's different than if you're a streamer speaking to, to young guys, right? So it's that right messenger, right message, right place, right? Sort of like comms 101. But then there's just the question of like doing it. And I think one of the things that's happening right now is people feel paralyzed because there's so much going on. And so rather than jumping in with something, everybody is waiting for somebody else to tell them what to do.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Reimagining Liberty. If you'd like to listen to future episodes free of ads and sponsorships, you can become a supporter for just a few dollars a month. Head to www.aaronrosspowell.com to learn more.